It seems like John F. Kennedy is a singular figure in that he was able to have the humility to reach out to Khrushchev, and also the strength and integrity to resist the what did you call them, the salad brass and institutions like the CIA. So that makes it particularly tragic that he was killed. To what degree was CIA involved, or the various bureaucracy involved in his death?
The evidence that the CIA was involved in my uncle's murder, and that they were subsequently involved in the cover-up and continue to be involved in the cover-up. I mean, there's still 5,000 documents that they won't release, 60 years later, is, I think, so insurmountable and so, mountainous and overwhelming that it's beyond any reasonable doubt, including, dozens of confessions of people who were involved in the assassination, but every kind of document, and I mean, it came as a surprise recently to most Americans, I think, the release of these documents in which the press, the American media, finally acknowledged that, yeah, Lee Harvey Oswald was a CIA asset, that he was recruited, in 1957. He was a Marine working at the Atasui Air Force Base, which was the CIA Air Force Base, with the U-2 flights, which was a CIA program, and that he was recruited by James Jesus Angleton, who was the director of counterintelligence, and then sent on a fake defection to Russia, and then brought back, to Dallas. And people didn't know that, even though it's been known for decades. But it never percolated into the mainstream media because they have such a, they have such an allergy to anything that challenges the Warren Report. When Congress investigated my uncle's murder in the 1970s, the Church Committee did, and they did, 2.5-year investigation, and they had many, many more documents and much more testimony available to them than the Warren Commission had. And this was a decade after the Warren Commission. They came to the conclusion that my uncle was killed by a conspiracy, and there was a division where essentially one guy on that committee believed it was primarily the mafia. But Richard Schweitzer, the senator who head of the committee, said, straight out, the CIA was involved in the murder of the President of the United States. Oh, if I've talked to most of the staff on that committee, and they said, yeah, and the CIA was stonewalling us the whole way through. And the actual people that the CIA appointed, George Johannides, who the CIA appointed as a liaison to the committee, they brought him out of retirement. He had been one of the masterminds of the assassination. It's impossible to even talk about a tiny fraction of the evidence here. What I suggest to people, there are hundreds of books written about this that, assemble this evidence and mobilize the evidence. The best book to me for people to read is James Douglas's book, which is called The Unspeakable. And Douglas does this extraordinary, he's an extraordinary scholar, and he does this just an amazing job of digesting and summarizing and mobilizing all of the probably 1 million documents and, the evidence from all these confessions that have come out into a coherent story. And it's riveting to read. And, I recommend people who do not take my word for it, and don't take anybody else's word for it. Go ahead and do the research yourself. And one way to do that is probably the most efficient way is to read Douglas's book, because he has all the references there.
So if it's true that CIA had a hand in this assassination, how is it possible for them to amass so much power? How is it possible for them to become corrupt? And is it individuals or is it the entire institution?
No, it's not the entire institution. My daughter-in-law who's helping to run my campaign, was a CIA, in the clandestine services for all of her career. She was a spy in the weapons of mass destruction program in the Mideast and in China. And there's 22,000 people who work for the CIA. Probably 20,000 of those are patriotic Americans and really good public servants, and they're doing important work for our country. But the institution is corrupt, and because the higher ranks of the institution. And in fact, Mike Pompeo said something like this to me the other day. He was the director of the CIA. He said, when I was there, I did not do a good job of cleaning up that agency. And he said the entire upper bureaucracy of that agency are people who do not believe in the institutions of democracy. This is what he said to me. So I don't know if that's true, but I know that, that's significant. He's a smart person, and he ran the agency, and he was the Secretary of State. But it's no mystery how that happened. We know the history. The CIA was originally, first of all, there was great reluctance in 1947. For the first time, we had a secret spy agency in this country during World War II called the OSS. That was disbanded after the war because Congress said having a secret spy agency is incompatible with a democracy. Secret spy agencies are things that, like the KGB, the Stasi in East Germany, Savak in Iran, and PEEP in Chile, and whatever, all over the world. They all have to do with totalitarian governments. They're not something that you can have. That it's antithetical to democracy to have that. But in 1947, we created it. Truman signed it in, but it was initially an espionage agency, which means information gathering, which is important. It's to gather and consolidate information from many, many different sources from all over the world, and then put those in reports so the White House, so the president can make good decisions based upon valid information, evidence-based, decision making. But Allen Dulles, who was essentially the first head of the agency, made a series of legislative machinations and political machinations that gave additional powers to the agency and opened up the what they called then the plans division, which is the plans division is the dirty tricks. It's the black ops, fixing elections, murdering what they call executive action, which means killing foreign leaders, and making small wars, and bribing and blackmailing people, stealing elections, and that kind of thing. And the reason at that time, we were in the middle of the Cold War, and Truman and then Eisenhower did not want to go to war. They didn't want to commit troops. And it seemed to them that, this was a way of kind of fighting the Cold War secretly and doing it at minimal cost by changing events sort of invisibly. And so it was seductive to them. But everybody, Congress, when they first voted it in place, both political parties said, if we create this thing, it could turn into a monster and it could undermine our values. And today it's so powerful, and nobody knows what its budget is. Plus, it has its own investment fund, In-Q-Tel, which has invested, made, I think, 2,000 investments in Silicon Valley. So it has ownership of a lot of these tech companies that, and a lot of the CEOs of those tech companies have signed state secrecy agreements with the CIA, which if they even reveal that they have signed that, they can go to jail for 20 years and have their assets removed, etc. So the influence that the agency has, the capacity to influence events at every level in our country, is really frightening. And then for most of its life, the CIA was banned from propagandizing Americans. But we learned that they were doing it anyway. So in 1973, during the Church Committee hearings, we learned that the CIA had a program called Operation Mockingbird, where they had at least 400 members, leading members of the United States press corps, from the New York Times, the Washington Post, ABC, CBS, NBC, etc., who were secretly working for the agency and steering news coverage to support CIA priorities. And they agreed at that time to disband Operation Mockingbird in '73. But there's indications they didn't do that, and the CIA today is the biggest funder of journalism around the world. The biggest funder is through USAID. The United States funds journalism in almost every country in the world. It owns newspapers. It has journalists on it, thousands and thousands of journalists on its payroll. They're not supposed to be doing that in the United States, but in 2016, President Obama changed the law to make it legal now for the CIA to propagandize Americans. And I think, we can't look at the Ukraine war and how that was, how the narrative has been formed in the minds of Americans and say that the CIA had nothing to do with that.
Well, what is the mechanism by which the CIA influences the narrative? Do you think it's indirectly?
Through the press.
Indirectly through the press, or directly by funding the press?
Directly through key members. I mean, there's certain press organs that have been linked, to the agency, that the people who run those organs, things like the Daily Beast, now Rolling Stone, editor of Rolling Stone, Noah Schlackman, has deep relationships with the intelligence community, Salon, Daily Kos.
But I wonder why they would do it. So from my perspective, it just seems like the job of a journalist is to have an integrity where your opinion cannot be influenced or bought.
I agree with you, but I actually think that the entire field of journalism has really shamed itself in recent years, because it's become, the principal newspapers in this country and the television station, the legacy media, have abandoned their tradition of which was, when I was a kid, listen, my house was filled with the greatest journalists alive at that time. People like Ben Bradley, like Anthony Lewis, Mary McGrory, Pete Hamill, Jack Newfield, Jimmy Breslin, and many, many others. And after my father died, they started the RFK Journalism Awards to recognize integrity and courage, journalistic integrity and courage. And for that generation of journalism, they believed that the function of a journalist was to maintain this posture of fierce skepticism toward any aggregation of power, including government authority. That people in authority lie, and that they always have to be questioned, and that their job was to speak truth to power and to be guardians of the First Amendment right to free expression. But if you look what happened during the pandemic, it was the inverse of that kind of journalism, where the major press organs in this country were, instead of speaking truth to power, they were doing the opposite. They were broadcasting propaganda. They became propaganda organs for the government agencies, and they were actually censoring the speech of anybody who dissents, of the powerless. And in fact, it was an organized conspiracy. And it was, the name of it was the Trusted News Initiative, and some of the major press organs in our country signed on to it, and they agreed not to print stories or facts that departed from government orthodoxy. So the Washington Post was the signature, the UPI, the AP, and then the four media, or the four social media groups, Microsoft, Twitter, Facebook, and Google, all signed on to the Trusted News Initiative. It was started by the BBC, organized by them, and the purpose of it was to make sure nobody could print anything about government that departed from government orthodoxy. And the way it worked is the UPI, the AP, and which are the news services that provide most of the news around the country, and the Washington Post would decide what news was permissible to print And a lot of it was about COVID, but also Hunter Biden's laptops, where it was impermissible to suggest that those were real or that they had stuff on there that was compromising. And and by the way, what I'm telling is all well documented, and I'm litigating on it right now. So I'm part of a lawsuit against the TNI. And so I know a lot about what happened, and I have all this documented. And people can go to our website. There's a letter on my Substack now to Michael Scher of the Washington Post that outlines all this and gives all my sources. Because Michael Scher accused me of being a conspiracy theorist when he was actually part of a conspiracy, a true conspiracy, to suppress anybody who was departing from government orthodoxies by either censoring them completely or labeling them conspiracy theorists.
I mean, you can understand the intention and the action, the difference between, as we talked about, you can understand the intention of such a thing being good, that in a time of a catastrophe, in a time of a pandemic, there's a lot of risk to saying untrue things, but that's a slippery slope that leads into a place where the journalistic integrity that we talked about is completely sacrificed, and then you can deviate from truth.
If you read their internal memorandum, including the statements of the leader of the Trusted News Initiative, I think her name's Jennifer Cecil, and you can go on our website and see her statement, and she says the purpose of this is that we're now. She says, when people look at us, they think we're competitors, but we're not. The real competitors are coming from all these alternative news sources now all over the network, and they're hurting public trust in us, and they're hurting our economic model, and they have to be choked off and crushed. And the way that we're going to do that is to make an agreement with the social media sites that if we label their information misinformation, the social media sites will deplatform it, or they will throttle it, or they will shadow ban it, which destroys the economic model of those alternative competitive sources of information. So that's true. But the point you make is an important point, that the journalists themselves, who probably didn't know about the TNI agreement, certainly I'm sure they didn't, they believe that they're doing the right thing by suppressing information that may challenge, government proclamations on COVID. But I mean, there's a danger to that. And the danger is that, once you appoint yourself an arbiter of what's true and what's not true, then there's really no end to the power that you have now assumed for yourself, because now your job is no longer to inform the public. Your job now is to manipulate the public. And if you end up manipulating the public in collusion with powerful entities, then you become the instrument of authoritarian rule, rather than the opponent of it. And it becomes the inverse of journalism in a democracy.